guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to share with you a review of the new Wet n Wild Rose in the Air eyeshadow palette, and I wanted to share whether or not it is a dupe for the Modern Renaissance palette. A lot of people are comparing these two palettes, so I'm actually wearing one of each palette on my eye today. So I'm doing a tutorial with each of these and letting you guys know how they compare to each other, how they swatch next to each other, how they perform on the eyes, and whether this $5 palette is a dupe for this $42 palette. So if you guys want to see whether or not the Wet n Wild palette is a dupe for Modern Renaissance, then just keep on watching. Alright, so recently Wet n Wild just released 4 new eyeshadow palettes. They're all $5 each, and this one has been super hyped up because a lot of people are comparing it to the Modern Renaissance palette. I've already seen this video out there. A lot of people have done dupes on this, and I definitely wanted to test it out for myself because I was a little skeptical about it. I always find it really hard to find good drugstore eyeshadows. Like, I always find that to be one of the hardest products to find from the drugstore that's comparable to high-end. So I was definitely super curious about this palette because honestly it looks so similar, and you guys are going to be really impressed when you see the swatches of both of these. So this is a $5 palette. You get 10 shades, and then you get 0.35 ounces of product in this palette. And in the Modern Renaissance palette, this is a $42 palette, and you actually get less product. You get 0.28 ounces of product in the whole thing. So comparing the Modern Renaissance palette to like a chocolate bar palette or a tartlet palette, you actually get a lot less product in this palette compared to those. So for a high-end palette, this one actually has very little product to what's standard for other high-end products. But this looks so tiny, and then you get less in here, so that's something to definitely keep in mind. And then this is only $5. So I'm going to start off by swatching all the shades next to each other, all the shades in here and the similar shade in the Modern Renaissance palette, so you guys can see how similar everything is. And we start off with this transition shade, and this is very similar to Warm Taupe in the Modern Renaissance palette. So this side will be Wet n Wild, and then this side will be the Modern Renaissance palette. So this is the shade that is the most similar. So we have Wet n Wild, and then we have Warm Taupe, and then this is Tempera from the Modern Renaissance palette. And then the matte light shade in here, or it is matte in here, and Tempera is just a little bit satin, so it's definitely not a true dupe with this shade from the Wet n Wild palette. Then I just swatched the shade Regal from the Modern Renaissance palette, and that's super similar to this orange shade from Wet n Wild. So those are pretty identical. So next we have Primavera, which is the lid color I'm wearing on one of my eyes, compared to the lid color I'm wearing on the other eye today, which is this shimmer shade. It's like a champagne color, and these are very similar. Like on my eyes right now, I don't know if you can tell which one is which because they do look super similar. So next we have the shade Red Ochre, which is comparable to this red shade right here. And these are also very similar. I compared these two, and I have each of them on my eyes today. Then we have the shade Buen Fresco, which is this lavender shade compared to the shade in the Wet n Wild palette. And these shades are super similar. The Wet n Wild one is just maybe slightly more lavender and less cool tone compared to the Modern Renaissance one. Next I have this shade from the Wet n Wild palette, and that's super similar to Love Letter from Modern Renaissance. So far the colors of everything side by side are pretty much identical. You get a little bit more of a sheer finish with a few of the Wet n Wild shades, but generally everything looks pretty much identical. Next we have Antique Bronze from the Modern Renaissance palette. This is like a coppery purple tone shade, and this shade is so similar. So everything just gets like more and more similar as I'm swatching things. And then I'm moving into the brown shade from Modern Renaissance, and that's the shade Cypress Umber. It's this cool tone brown shade. We have this brown shade in the Wet n Wild palette. Then lastly we have Raw Sienna from the Modern Renaissance palette, and then this transition shade up here from the Wet n Wild palette. So everything in this palette, like the colors themselves, are basically identical. So again, this is the Wet n Wild side, and this is the Modern Renaissance side. So everything is super identical. The tones of everything is pretty much identical. If anything, with the Wet n Wild shades, some of them like right in the middle, some of these deeper purples and pinks are a little more patchy, a little less pigmented compared to the Modern Renaissance palette. So those are the swatches of both palettes. I'm going to go ahead into the tutorial so you guys can see which eye look I did with the Modern Renaissance, which I did with the Wet n Wild. So I did one full eye look. One eye has Wet n Wild, one eye has Modern Renaissance. You guys will see how everything blends out and everything from each palette. Alright, so I wanted to have you guys pretty close up so you can see like how things look as they're blending. I think I'm going to go with, let's do the Wet n Wild on this eye. I'm going to keep it on this side so I don't mix them up. And then Anastasia on this eye. And I have a ton of brushes in front of me because I'm not going to double dip. Like I don't want to use like the same brush for both. And I have used this palette already, so I know how this palette looks on its own, how it wears throughout the day and everything. So I have my full thoughts about the palette on its own, and I've swatched it compared to the Anastasia palette, but I have not done an eye look using both. So I'm gonna go in with this shade for my first transition shade, and that's super similar to Raw Sienna from Modern Renaissance. So those are gonna be the transition shades that I start off with. And I'm going to be using my Sigma E40 for this side. And I'm going in with a decent amount of product on my brush. I normally do whenever I'm using a like warmer brown shade, something that I know is going to suit my complexion. Usually I use less product when I'm using a more bold transition color. So just applying the shadow once, you can see it's like really pigmented, but then there's like patchiness right in my crease. But if I go in again, I'm going to get rid of that patchiness, but I want to show you if I go in once with my Modern Renaissance what it looks like. And I'm going to use this Moda brush for my Modern Renaissance side. They're pretty similar. This one's just slightly more fluffy, but they're almost like the same size. And I'm going in with Raw Sienna. Alright, so both of those shades look the same on the eyes. I'm going to go in again with the Wet n Wild palette. And this side is just a little patchy right here, but this side I feel like has less product to it. So I'm just going to go in one more time with each. And I think this shade looks pretty good in my crease. Where it's a little patchy right here, I'm going to cover that up anyways with my lid color. So where I need it to really show up, it looks totally fine. And then I'm just going to go back in with Raw Sienna on my left eye. So next I'm going in with the two red shades in each palette. I'm going to do more of like outer V and kind of in my crease a little bit. I don't want it to be too red, but I just want to add like some more shadows into my crease just so you guys can see how they build up. With my Wet n Wild side, I'm using a Moda brush. This is a crease brush. It was in my BoxyCharm a couple months ago. It's a really awesome brush. So this shade definitely goes on, really pigmented. I find that with all the mattes in this palette because I have used a lot of the other mattes as well for different eye looks. And then I'm using a similar size brush from IT Cosmetics with this shade Red Ochre for my right eye. So those shades look so similar. This shade's probably just a little bit more pigmented. So I have a million of these brushes that I like to use for my lid, Morphe M124. I'm going to go in with the two shimmer shades that are really pretty from this palette. This one right here from Wet n Wild, and then Primavera from Modern Renaissance. I want to wet them so bad and just have them like be really shimmery. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to apply them both dry first, so you guys can see how they look dry, and then I'll wet them both. So I'm starting off with Wet n Wild and a dry brush. All right, so that completely covered up where I had like the patchiness right on my crease, but I definitely still need to go back and blend that out. And then taking Primavera, and I keep hitting pan like even more in this palette. I'm gonna be repurchasing this palette regardless. Like I just love this palette. I'm like super attached to it, so I want a new one. Alright, so I'm just going to take my crease brush from each side to blend out the edge with no additional product. So I'm just taking some Fix Plus on each dry brush. And I think this shade, if you were to recreate like an eye look with Modern Renaissance, using this as a lid shade is what can make it look completely identical because it's really pigmented and it goes on really creamy. And then let me wet my Modern Renaissance brush. Gonna go in with one more shadow on each eye at least. Gonna go in with my Morphe brush on the Wet n Wild side, and I'm using the dark brown, which is a dupe for Cypress Umber, the darker like brown. It's like a dark cool tone brown. And I'm just gonna pack that on. I don't want this look to get too dark either, but I just want a little bit right in my outer corner. This is crazy how similar everything looks. It's looking pretty much identical, and I'm using a Real Techniques brush for this side. So I'm just gonna take the lightest shade in each palette to highlight my brow bone. And this shade is matte. Maybe it'll look weird if I have one matte side and one like satin side, but this is how I would do this look with each palette. So let's just see how we do here. And then I'm taking like the little tiny bits I have left of tempera. So that is the top of each eye. I'm gonna go ahead and do my lower lash line. Let's do the transition shade that we started with for each eye, and I'm using a Smashbox liner brush. I'm taking a tiny bit of that dark brown shade just in my outer corner. Then we're going in with raw sienna for my Anastasia side, and a tiny bit of Cypress Umber. Alright, so here is each eye with just a shadow, so you guys can take a good look at it, because once I do lashes, they're going to just look even more similar, because of course I'm going to put on like the same pair of lashes for both eyes. And I tried my best, my very, very best, to try to blend equally for each eye and not like spend extra time subconsciously with the Wet n Wild side versus the Anastasia side, and use like really similar brushes. So here is each eye. I think they look like identical. I think they look pretty much the same. Any difference is probably just like user error, like how I did my makeup, and not necessarily the actual product. Like I can see that I definitely applied this shadow slightly higher on this side, like the lid color, but that's totally obviously me and not the eyeshadow formula. So that is what everything looks like. It looks like the same. To me, it looks pretty much identical. And I mean, you guys can see this like pretty close up. How close you would be in person is like right up to my face to see it in this much detail. So I think it looks pretty much identical. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. So this is the drugstore side. This is the Anastasia side. Let me like hold this up so you guys can see like a better look, because I see it like in reverse in my mirror, so it confuses me. But this is what they look like, drugstore, high end. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm gonna go ahead and toss on my lashes, which is gonna make everything like look the same. And yeah, then finish up with this video. All right, so with lashes, I think both eye looks look pretty much identical. And I've been wearing the Modern Renaissance palette since the week it came out. I've been wearing it for years. Obviously, like I've used this palette up. And I actually do want to repurchase another one because I love this palette and I love the formula so much. This is probably my favorite formula in my eyeshadow collection, and I have a ton of eyeshadow palettes. Compared to the Wet n Wild palette, I have been wearing this palette on its own with both eyes done. And you guys saw blending it out and everything, it takes just a little extra work compared to the Modern Renaissance palette. So that is the one thing where it's not a dupe, is the blendability. But you can get the exact same eye looks and it's gonna last just as long. So I've worn the Wet n Wild palette on its own for 12 hours or more on my eyes, with lashes, with no lashes, with different shades, and it lasts all day. Like I don't find that it fades throughout the day. It doesn't look any different throughout the day compared to using the Modern Renaissance palette. So that is definitely a plus, because usually that's where things might not be a dupe, like how long they last, how they end up wearing throughout the day. I find that it wears the exact same. Like it doesn't feel like a $5 palette. It feels the same as the Modern Renaissance when I'm wearing it for hours. But going on to the eyes, it's just a little bit different. So definitely if you guys are doing like soft glam looks or natural looks, you can definitely recreate the looks that you would do with the Modern Renaissance palette with this palette. And I think it's great if you don't have the Modern Renaissance palette, but you want to like follow along with YouTube tutorials with that palette without spending the money. You can definitely achieve that with this. It has like all the same shades. The only ones that are missing are what's like some of the pinky tones, and even the darker tones up here, or even this shade soft ochre. Like those are all shades that you can find from other palettes, or you can just use a different shade. Like you can pretty much use both of these like interchangeably, and also like the pinky tones in here. So you can get like the exact same looks with the Modern Renaissance and the Wet n Wild palette. But if you're going for like very like intense looks, like very detailed, very advanced looks, is going to take like a little bit more blending. It's probably going to be trickier with this palette. So overall, yes, I prefer my Modern Renaissance because it's like one of my favorite palettes. I still plan on repurchasing the Modern Renaissance palette because I have run out of some of the shades, but I do enjoy this palette as well. If you do not have the Modern Renaissance and you're not like dying to have it, but you want those colors, definitely check this out for $5. It's like such a great deal too. Yeah, let's just talk about that for a minute because I don't have another $5 palette in my collection where you can get like such a similar look. So that is definitely such a great deal, and I think I keep forgetting that it's $5. Like, I'm thinking of this as like a $15 or $20 palette, but for $5, yes, you can get a really awesome look. It's really blendable. You're gonna get that pigmentation. It's just gonna take like a slightly like 30 more seconds of blending compared to Modern Renaissance. Alright guys, so that is everything for today's video. I hope you enjoyed seeing whether or not the Wet n Wild palette was a dupe for the Modern Renaissance palette, and also seeing an eye look with both palettes, and I really can't tell the difference. I was actually a little bit concerned going into filming because I have places to be today and I didn't want to end up with two different eye looks, but they look so similar. I can't tell the difference with either of them. So definitely let me know if you've tried out the Wet n Wild palette in the comments, and I'll have both palettes listed in my description box. If you guys like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you guys soon in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.